The year 1899 was a time of magnificent noise. It was the sound of steel striking steel, of electricity humming in new glass bulbs, of a new century preparing to be born in a cacophony of progress. Science, it was believed, was the great lamp that would illuminate the last dark corners of the universe, and every mystery would soon be solved, measured, and explained. But beneath this grand industrial roar, a quieter, older sound persisted, the whisper of ghosts. In the gaslit parlors of Boston, the spiritualist movement was in full bloom, a world of seances and mediums who promised that the greatest mystery of all, death, was not an end, but merely a locked door. It was in this collision of two worlds, the mechanical and the spectral, that the brilliant acoustic engineer Elias Thorne lost his wife, and then his mind. Elias was not a man of superstition. He was a man of vibration, of frequency, of the elegant mathematical laws that governed the unseen world of sound. His work had made him wealthy, his inventions helping to clarify the fuzzy tones of the telephone and the phonograph. But when his wife, Lenora, was taken by a sudden fever, the science that had defined his life offered him no comfort, no explanation for the profound and absolute silence she had left behind. Grief became his new laboratory. He was consumed by a single, obsessive thought, an idea that was equal parts scientific arrogance and desperate human hope. If a voice is merely a vibration in the air, what happens to that vibration when the body is gone? Does it simply vanish? Or does it fade to a frequency too subtle for the human ear to perceive? He believed he could build an ear that could listen. He locked himself away in his Boston brownstone, the room still thick with the memory of his wife. He began to build a machine. He called it in his private journals, the Echo Engine. It was a phonograph, but one of a monstrous and delicate sensitivity. He replaced standard components with silver filaments, believing the metal to be a better conduit for ethereal vibrations. He designed a recording horn lined with crushed quartz, a mineral long associated with spiritual energy. It was a grotesque hybrid of cutting-edge science and arcane folklore, a machine built to record not sound, but the memory of sound, a machine designed to listen to the silence. For weeks, his work yielded nothing. He would let the wax cylinders spin for hours in the empty rooms of his house, the parlor where Lenora had played the piano, the bedroom where she had died, and the playback was always the same. A maddening, abrasive hiss of static, the sound of absolute absence. His grief and frustration mounted, the silence in his headphones a constant, mocking reminder of the silence in his heart. On a cold November night, after a month of maddening failure, Elias was prepared to admit defeat, to finally surrender to the silence of his grief. He took the last of his specially prepared wax cylinders, the result of a continuous, 12-hour recording of the empty chair by the hearth where Lenora used to sit, and placed it on the machine. He put the headphones on, his eyes closed, expecting to hear only the familiar empty hiss of failure. The needle dropped. The static began. But then, through the abrasive noise, impossibly, another sound emerged. It was not a word. It was not a whisper. It was a single clear musical note, a faint C-sharp, held for 3 perfect, heartbreaking seconds before fading back into the static. Elias tore the headphones from his ears, his body trembling, a cold sweat on his brow. He knew that sound. It was the single pure note Lenora used to hum under her breath when she was lost in thought, a sound he had not heard in a year, a sound he believed he would never hear again. The single perfect note of C-sharp was the key that unlocked Elias Thorne's grief and turned it into a feverish, manic obsession. The sound was proof. It was validation. It was the first faint signal from the undiscovered country he so desperately needed to map. For a single night, he allowed himself the catharsis of tears, playing the recording over and over. The 3-second ghost of his wife's hum, a balm on his raw and wounded soul. Then the engineer returned. He poured his remaining fortune into his work, transforming the top floor of his Boston home into a true acoustic laboratory. He lined the walls with cork and velvet, creating a room of absolute deadened silence. He sold his father's pocket watch, a family heirloom, to purchase more silver for his filaments, convinced it was the element that resonated with the world beyond. The echo engine grew, its brass horn becoming larger, its wax cylinders treated with a chemical wash of his own design, intended to make the medium more receptive, more porous to the vibrations he sought. His efforts were rewarded. The recordings grew clearer. The faint hums and notes were soon joined by whispers, fragmented and ethereal, like words spoken through a veil of falling water. And then, after a week of tireless refinement, he heard her voice. It was faint, buried deep in the static, but it was unmistakably Lenora. Elias. So cold. The words were a whisper, a sigh, a fragment of a thought from a place he could not imagine. He wept as he listened, his heart a painful, joyous knot in his chest. He had done it. He had built a bridge across the silent, shoreless ocean of death. He spent the next several days in a state of rapturous communion, recording for hours, then spending hours more with the headphones pressed to his ears, hunting for the precious, fleeting whispers of his wife. He heard her name. He heard the name of the ear-old dog. He heard the word stars. Each fragment was a jewel, a proof of survival that he hoarded like a miser. But as the echo engine grew more powerful, it grew less discriminate. It was not a private telephone to his wife's soul. It was a vast open microphone, and it was beginning to pick up the voices of the entire unseen world. The recordings became crowded. Lenora's soft whispers were now jostled by other stranger voices, a child weeping for its mother. Two men locked in a bitter spectral argument over a game of cards, a woman singing a forgotten discordant lullaby. The silence of his house was now filled with a cacophony of ghosts, a chorus of the lost and the lingering. His beautiful, elegant bridge had become a crowded, noisy thoroughfare for the city's unremembered dead, and he was the unwilling gatekeeper. He tried to tune them out, to isolate the frequency of his wife's voice, but the machine was too powerful. It heard everything. Elias was beginning to feel like a man eavesdropping on 1,000 private tragedies, when he first heard the voice that would change everything. It was a man's voice, rough and angry, with the accent of a dock worker. It was not speaking to him, but about someone else, a name Elias knew. He thinks no one saw. The voice growled from the static, a phantom rage that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. But I saw, at the wharf, old man Hemlock, with his clean hands and his fat bank account. He never saw the knife. Poor Ames never saw the knife. Elias ripped the headphones off, his heart pounding. Alastair Hemlock was a shipping magnate, a pillar of Boston society, and a former colleague of Elias's. His business partner, a man named Ames, had indeed died a month prior, an apparent accidental fall from a high scaffold at the wharf. It had been ruled a tragedy. A coincidence, Elias told himself. A trick of the static. Oh, is mind forming patterns from noise. But the voice was persistent. Night after night, the same gruff, accusatory whisper cut through the other voices, repeating the name. Hemlock. The knife. Ames. It was a secret. A piece of forbidden, earthly knowledge being broadcast from a place that should have no knowledge of the living. Elias, tormented, knew he had to put the phantom to the test. He arranged to attend a charity symphony with Hemlock, a man now living under a terrible, spectral suspicion. During the intermission, in the grand, chandelier-lit lobby, Elias, feigning a casual sympathy, brought up the tragic death of Ames. He watched Alastair Hemlock's face like a hawk. The magnate performed his grief perfectly, his expression a mask of sorrow as he spoke of the unfortunate accident. But as he lifted his crystal glass of champagne to his lips, Elias saw it. A thin, white, almost invisible scar running across the knuckles of his right hand. the kind of scar a man might get if his hand slipped on the hilt of a knife. The ghost on the wax cylinder had been telling the truth. The echo engine was not just a bridge to the past. It was a window into the secret murderous hearts of the living, and Elias Thorne was the only one looking through it. The knowledge of Alistair Hemlock's guilt was a poison that seeped into every corner of Elias Thorne's life. He was no longer a grieving husband seeking solace. He was the custodian of a terrible truth, a secret that could shatter the fragile peace of Boston's elite. He could not go to the police. What proof did he have? A phantom's testimony captured on a spinning wax cylinder? They would lock him in an asylum. He was trapped in a moral prison of his own making, the unwilling confessor to the city's murdered dead. The silence he had once sought to conquer now seemed like a lost paradise. His own silence, the silence he was now forced to keep, was a heavy, suffocating shroud. His grief for Lenora, once a clean and noble pain, was now tainted by this new, sordid horror. His obsession shifted. The initial, desperate search for his wife's loving whispers became a morbid, compulsive hunt for the secrets of others. He became a spectral detective, a ghostly forensic investigator. He would read the newspapers, his eyes scanning the obituaries and the reports of accidents and unsolved crimes. He would then take his machine, now smaller and more portable, and conduct his recordings near the sites of these tragedies. A factory fire that had claimed the lives of 3 men. A young woman who had thrown herself from the Charlestown Bridge. A banker who had died of a sudden violent illness. He would sit for hours in a rented room nearby, his headphones on, the wax cylinder spinning, listening. And the dead would speak. They spoke of arson, of poison, of debts and betrayals and loves that had curdled into murder. Elias was compiling a secret, spectral history of the city's sins, a library of whispers that only he could read. He became a recluse. His colleagues from the Acoustic Society found his door bolted, his letters unanswered. They whispered that poor Thorne's grief had finally undone him. They did not know that he was not undone, but that he was busier, more consumed than he had ever been in his life. His world had shrunk to the 4 velvet-lined walls of his study and the vast, teeming, invisible city of the dead he was now charting. The project was no longer about love. It had become a grim, godlike pursuit of a truth the world was not meant to know, but the knowledge was a cancer. It began to metastasize, to creep from the public sphere of crime and into the intimate circle of his own life. One evening, listening to a recording made near the home of a recently deceased socialite, a woman he and Lenora had known socially, he heard a new familiar voice. It was the woman herself, her voice not filled with the terror of a violent end, but with a quiet, bitter venom. She did not speak of murder. She spoke of a secret affair, of years of lies, and she spoke the name of her husband's mistress, a name that made Elias's blood run cold. It was his own sister-in-law, the wife of his younger brother Daniel. He felt a wave of revulsion. This was not a crime he could solve, not a secret he could expose. It was a private, ugly truth that now implicated his own family. The next time he saw his brother and his wife at a family dinner, he could not look at them. The machine had made him a stranger in his own life, the bearer of secrets that were not his to keep, but which were impossible to forget. The world of the living was becoming a thin, paper facade, and only he could see the rot and the lies behind it. He was in his study late one night, the gas lamps humming, cataloging the whispers on a new cylinder, a recording from the old granary burying ground. He had grown accustomed to the pleas, the sorrows, the disjointed fragments of 100 spectral lives. He was the listener, the observer, forever separated from the voices by the hiss of the static and the veil of death. He was adjusting the needle, his ear trained to catch the faintest sound, when a new voice cut through the noise. It was unlike any he had ever recorded. It was a woman's voice, but it was not a whisper. It was perfectly clear, impossibly close, and utterly calm. And it was not speaking about the past. It was speaking directly to him. The listener, the voice said, the words forming in his headphones with a cold, terrifying intimacy, as if spoken directly into his ear. The man with the silver ear. We see you, Elias Thorne. We have been watching you through the static. A pause, in which Elias's heart seemed to stop. And now we have a message for you. For the silence that followed the voice in his headphones was more profound and more terrifying than any static he had ever recorded. Elias Thorne sat frozen in his chair. The blood turned to ice in his veins. The world he had discovered, the spectral plane he had so arrogantly tapped into with his wires and his silver, was not a passive echo of the past. It was an active, intelligent, and observant consciousness. We see you, Elias Thorne. The words implied a reversal of the experiment's very nature. He thought he had been the observer, the scientist looking through the microscope. He now understood, with a soul-crushing terror, that he was the one on the glass slide. He was the subject, and the entities on the other side of the veil had been watching him all along. He did not sleep for 2 days, afraid to turn the machine on, but more afraid of the silence that now felt charged and purposeful. Finally, unable to bear the weight of the unanswered question, he returned to his study, his hands trembling, and placed the headphones over his ears. He turned the dial, and the voice was there instantly, as if it had been waiting for him. It was the same calm, clear female voice, but now he could hear other, fainter voices behind it. A chorus of whispers that seemed to be feeding her the words. You are afraid, the voice stated, not as a question, but as a simple observation. You sought one soul in the silence. You found us all. Do not be afraid. We are not the enemy. We are the truth. The voice, the chorus, explained their nature. They were not the confused, earthbound spirits who replayed their sorrows in an endless loop. They were something else. A collective. The self-appointed archivists of injustice. They spoke of the fabric of the worlds, of the way a life cut short by a secret crime leaves a tear, a snag in the great tapestry. These unfinished stories, they explain, kept souls from their proper journey. They were the source of the static, the pain that Elias had been recording. And his machine, his beautiful, terrible echo engine, was the only instrument in the living world that could hear their pleas. You built a bridge, the voice said. And now the petitioners have come to cross it. We have chosen you as our instrument, Elias Thorne. You will be our hands in the world of flesh. You will bring the truth to light. You will finish the stories. It was a coronation and a condemnation in a single breath. Elias, a man who had only wanted to hear his wife's hum, was being conscripted into an army of ghosts, tasked with being a detective for the dead. Before he could refuse, before his rational mind could even process the insane, blasphemous demand, they gave him his first case. A girl has died, the voice said, a note of cold sorrow entering its tone. Her name was Rose, a factory worker. The world says she took her own life. She did not. Her story is unfinished. Her soul is trapped in the static. The voice then gave him a single cryptic clue, a detail that had never been in any newspaper. She wore a locket, a small silver heart. It was a gift from her killer. When the police found her, it was empty. Ask the factory foreman, Mr. Briggs, why the locket was empty. Elias was faced with an impossible choice. He could smash the machine, sever the connection, and spend the rest of his life trying to forget the whispers, trying to unknow the terrible truths he now possessed. Or he could embrace this monstrous new purpose. He thought of Lenora, of the comfort her first ghostly note had brought him. He thought of the scar on Alistair Hemlock's hand, of the lie that man was living. He felt a wave of grim, weary resolve. His old life was already over, destroyed by grief. Perhaps this was his penance, his new reason for being. He would become the instrument. The next evening, he left his silent brownstone and journeyed to the smoky, gaslit world of the dockside taverns, a place he had not set foot in for years. He found the foreman, a large, brutish man named Briggs, his face slick with sweat and cheap whiskey. Elias, his voice trembling but his gaze steady, sat opposite him. He spoke of the dead girl, Rose. He mentioned the silver locket found on her body. The police report noted it was empty, Elias said, his words dropping like stones into the tavern's din. What was meant to be inside it? The foreman's boisterous demeanor vanished. His face went white as bone. He stared at Elias, the glass of whiskey shaking in his thick, grease-stained hand, a look of pure, superstitious terror dawning in his eyes. No one knew about what was in the locket, he whispered, his voice a choked, ragged thing. No one but me. And her. He leaned forward, his eyes wide with fear and suspicion. Who are you? The foreman, William Briggs, stared at Elias, his face a mask of sweat and disbelief. In the smoky, chaotic din of the tavern, the two men were locked in a silent, private bubble of terror. To Briggs, the gaunt, wild-eyed man before him was not a stranger. He was a specter, a creature who knew a secret that had been buried with a dead girl. His bravado crumbled, replaced by the primal fear of a man who believes he is in the presence of the supernatural. He began to speak, the words spilling out in a torrent of whiskey-soaked confession. He told Elias everything. He told him of Rose, of the affair, of the lies he had told her. He spoke of the locket, and the small, folded-up promise of a marriage he never intended to honor. He confessed that when Rose had discovered the truth about his wealthy wife and threatened to expose him, he had panicked. He had met her by the river, and in a moment of rage had silenced her, pushing her into the cold, dark water. He had stolen the incriminating note from the locket, but in his haste, had forgotten to replace it with the tiny portrait of himself it was meant to hold. He had created the very clue that had now undone him. Elias listened, his face a stone. He felt no pity, no triumph. He felt only the cold, heavy weight of a truth that had been exhumed from the grave and placed in his hands. He now had the full confession, the entire sordid story. But what could he do? It was the word of a terrified drunk against his own, the word of a man who could easily recant his confession in the sober light of day. He had no evidence that would stand in a court of law. He was a man armed with a ghost story. He left the tavern and walked the cold, gaslit streets back to his home, the foreman's terrified question echoing in his mind. Who are you? He was beginning to wonder the same thing himself. He returned to his study, to the silent, wait-ing machine. He put on the headphones, and the clear, calm voice was there, as if it had been listening, waiting. He recounted the foreman's confession, his own voice a monotone. He explained the impossibility of his situation, the lack of proof. The voice listened, and when he was done, there was a pause, a moment of what felt like profound, collective consideration from the other side. You are thinking in the terms of the living, Elias, the voice said, its tone patient, like a teacher instructing a slow student. The justice of your world is flawed. It requires proof of flesh and blood. Our justice requires only that the truth be known to those who matter. The voice then gave him his next set of instructions. He was not to be a witness for the police. He was to be a conduit for a haunting. The instructions were specific and chilling. Elias was to procure a new, blank wax cylinder and a second simple phonograph. He was not to record anything himself. He was to leave the blank cylinder on the echo engine for one full night, from dusk until dawn. We will write the letter, the voice had said. The next day, he took the now imprinted cylinder, sealed it and the new phonograph in a plain wooden crate, and, following the careful directions of the voice, had it delivered by an anonymous courier to the home of William Briggs, addressed to his wife. Elias felt a terrible thrill, a sense of participating in an ancient and powerful form of justice, a feeling of being a righteous instrument of some great unseen power. 3 days later, the Boston Daily Globe ran a small article on its society page, an item of gossip that Elias read with a tremor in his hands. Mrs. Amelia Briggs, the wife of a local factory foreman and daughter of the industrialist John Cartwright, had suffered a severe nervous breakdown. She had been found in her parlor, screaming, claiming to have heard the voice of a ghost coming from a strange machine. Her husband, William Briggs, had been immediately and publicly dismissed from his position at the Cartwright factory to avoid any association with the burgeoning scandal. His name and his wife's were ruined. Elias sat back in his chair, the newspaper trembling in his grip. He had done it. He had not brought a criminal to the police, but he had delivered a truth that had acted like a poison, destroying the man's life from the inside out. That night, as he sat before his machine, the clear, calm voice returned to his headphones, its tone one of quiet, cold satisfaction. "The story of Rose is finished," it said. "The injustice is balanced. You have proven yourself a worthy instrument, Elias Thorne." A pause, and then a chilling finality. "Now, for the next." The case of William Briggs was not an end. It was a beginning. Elias Thorne, the grieving inventor, was fully consumed by his new purpose. His life, once a quiet pursuit of scientific principles, became a grim and relentless crusade on behalf of the dead. The study on the top floor of his home was no longer a laboratory. It was a command center, a listening post on the border of eternity. The calm, collective voice from the echo engine became his sole confidant and his absolute master. The routine was unvarying. The voice would give him a name, a location, and a single cryptic clue. Elias would perform the recording, listening through the static to the last terrible moments of a life cut short by a secret crime. Then, the voice would instruct him on how to act. He was no longer just the listener. He was the ghost's own quiet, methodical vengeance. Over the next year, a strange and inexplicable plague of truth descended upon the city of Boston. A respected doctor, celebrated for his charity work, was found dead in his study by his own hand, leaving a note confessing to having poisoned 3 wealthy patients to inherit their estates. A confession prompted by an anonymous package containing a wax cylinder that, when played, produced only the sound of a dying man's final, ragged breaths. A powerful judge, known for his harsh sentences, suffered a complete mental collapse, driven mad by the incessant, whispering sound of a woman's voice coming from his own phonograph, a voice that belonged to a defendant he had knowingly sent to the gallows to protect a friend. A string of the city's most powerful and corrupt figures were undone, their lives dismantled not by evidence, but by whispers, by hauntings tailored with a perfect psychological precision. Elias was the architect of it all, but the work was hollowing him out. The constant communion with the vengeful and the soros, awful, was eroding his own soul, leaving a cold, sterile void where his grief had once been. He grew gaunt, a pale, haunted man who rarely saw the sun, his eyes perpetually shadowed with a knowledge not meant for the living. He no longer sought the gentle whispers of his wife Lenora. Her voice was lost in the clamor of the mission, her memory a fading ghost among the more demanding, more violent spirits that now commanded his every waking hour. He had become a perfect instrument, a human component in a machine that ran on injustice and grief. He did not know that the city had given him a name. In the smoky backrooms of taverns and the gaslit drawing rooms of the elite, they spoke in fearful whispers of a new phantom in Boston, a spirit they called the Whisper Man, a vengeful ghost who knew all the city's secrets and served a terrible, infallible justice. The downfall came from the one soul he had ever truly wanted to hear. He was working on a new case, a politician's suicide, that the voices insisted was a murder. He was filtering through the static, listening to the man's last moments, when a different voice bled through, faint but clear, a whisper of pure, heartbreaking sorrow. It was Lenora. "Elias, my love," He froze, his hand trembling on the machine's dial. It was the first time he had heard her voice in months, but the words that followed were not of comfort. They were a warning. "What have you become?" she whispered, her voice full of a pain that cut him deeper than any spectral rage. "This is not justice. This is a harvest. The machine, it doesn't just listen, my love. It feeds on the echoes. Stop, before there is nothing left of you." He tore the headphones from his ears, the velvet wet with a sudden cold sweat. Her voice, his original reason for this entire mad endeavor, was now telling him to stop. He was a puppet, and he had only just realized the nature of his masters. He put the headphones back on, a flicker of his old defiant self returning. "Who are you?" he demanded of the calm, clear voice that had been his guide, his god. "What is this for? Is it justice, or is it just feeding, as she says?" There was a long, cold silence on the line, a silence that felt ancient and vast. Then the voice returned, its placid, gentle tone gone, replaced by something utterly devoid of pity. "Justice is a story the living tell themselves to feel safe," it said. "We are the archivists. We collect the endings. And your story, Elias Thorne, is almost finished. We have one final case for you. It is the most important one of all." Elias Thorne sat before his machine, a king on a throne of gilded wire and polished brass, and listened to the judgment of his spectral masters. His story was almost finished. He had one final case. He felt a strange, cold sense of peace. After a year of serving as a phantom predator, of being the city's whisper man, he was weary. He was ready for the end. "Who?" he asked the voice in his headphones, his own voice a dead, emotionless thing. "Whose story must be finished?" There was a pause on the spectral line, a silence that felt heavy with a final, exquisite cruelty. Then the calm, clear voice spoke the name. "Lenora Thorne." The world dissolved into a roar of static in Elias's ears. His wife, his Lenora, the origin of his quest, the one pure and sorrowful reason for the machine's existence. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "You are mistaken. Her death was a fever. It was a tragedy, but it was not an injustice. Her story is finished." The voice was implacable. "There is a truth you do not know," it said. "An ending that was not recorded. Go back to your earliest recordings, the cylinder from the week after her death, the one you labeled static and grief. Listen again. Amplify the silence between the noise. You will hear." With a sense of dread so profound it felt like he was moving underwater, Elias searched through his meticulously catalogued library of whispers and found the old, dusty wax cylinder. He placed it on the machine, his hands trembling. He remembered the recording well. 12 hours of the most profound, abrasive static. A sound he had interpreted as the raw sound of absence. He recalibrated the engine, pushing its sensitivity to the absolute limit, using techniques the voices themselves had taught him. He placed the headphones on and dropped the needle. He heard the familiar hiss, but now, underneath it, buried impossibly deep, he heard it. A conversation. It was Lenora's voice, but not the sorrowful whisper he had cherished. It was alive, vibrant, and conspiratorial. And she was speaking to a man whose voice he recognized with a fresh wave of soul-crushing sickness. It was his own brother, Daniel. He listened, frozen, as the spectral recording played out the ultimate betrayal. He heard his wife, his sainted Lenora, speaking of her unhappiness, of her feeling of being trapped, of her plan to leave him. He heard his brother comforting her, speaking of a new life they would have together. The affair he had uncovered, the one that had ruined a judge's life, was not the only one. His entire world, the past he had been trying to reclaim, and the family he had in the present, was a lie. The collective voice then returned, its tone a cold, clinical whisper. Her story was not finished, it explained. She died before the truth could be told. The injustice is the lie you have been living, Elias. The final imbalance. You must correct it. You must deliver this message to your brother. It is the last story. It is your story. Finish it. In that moment, Elias finally understood. He saw the arc of his entire journey, not as a quest for justice, but as a meticulously engineered descent into despair. He had been a tool from the start. The engine did not just listen, it fed. It was a parasite that thrived on secrets and sorrow, and the collective voice was its insatiable appetite. It had used him to harvest the city's pain, and now, for its final meal, it demanded the only pure thing he had left, his own loving memory of his wife. This was not justice. This was consumption. He looked at the echo engine, his life's work, his masterpiece, his curse. It hummed softly, a beautiful, terrible machine built to translate grief into a weapon. He thought of Lenora's warning. Stop, before there is nothing left of you. He had nothing left but this final ugly choice. Be the instrument one last time and destroy his own heart, or defy the God in his machine. He made his choice. He stood up, his movements calm and deliberate. He took the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight solid and real in his hand. He looked at the spinning wax cylinder, at the silver filaments, at the great brass horn that had brought him so much power and so much pain. And with a cry that was a mixture of rage and liberation, he brought the poker down, again and again, shattering his creation, silencing the whispers, and finally, choosing the silence of his own grief over the cacophony of the dead. Elias Thorne was found a week later by his brother Daniel. He was slumped in his chair in his study, a quiet, peaceful smile on his face. The official cause of death was ruled as self-neglect. The newspapers reported the sad end of the brilliant but eccentric inventor, a man broken by his grief. His study was a wreck, his strange custom-built phonograph smashed to pieces, the reasons for his final madness a mystery. The machine was gone, but the whispers it had collected, the truths it had revealed, still echoed in the silent, haunted halls of Boston's elite. The official story is that a man died of a broken heart, but the unanswered question, the final chilling whisper, is not what happened to Elias Thorne, but what happened to the voices he trapped and then abandoned. Did he save his own soul by destroying the machine? Or did he simply condemn 1,000 unfinished stories to an eternity of silence, their pleas for justice now lost forever in the static?